Good afternoon. I'm Alistair Young, I'm professor in the Samnon School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, and it's my privilege to be hosting this webinar. I'm standing in for Michael Bond, who's in transit, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first talk in this third series of faculty development seminars for the EU certificate program at the University System of Georgia, which is organized by Georgia Tech's Jean Monnet Center of Excellence with support from the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. I'm obliged to say that nothing that you hear today, no matter how insightful, can be attributed to the European Union. I am delighted to introduce Dermot Hodson, who's mistakenly also labeled as me in on the screen. He is a professor of political economy at Birkbeck, University of London. He previously worked as an economist at the European Commission's Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs. He's published widely on the EU and Economic and Monetary Union. His books include Covering the Euro Area in Good Times and Bad for Oxford University Press in 2011, and with Imelda Meyer, The Transformation of EU Treaty Making, The Rise of Parliaments, Referendums and Courts since 1950 with Cambridge University Press. He's currently writing a book on the history of the European Union since the Maastricht Treaty for Yale University Press. He has also contributed excellent chapters on economic and monetary union to the three most recent editions of policy making in the European Union. Welcome, Dermot. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Alistair. I'm going to share my screen now, if that's okay. Let me just try. Okay, I hope you can see that okay. Great. Okay, so thanks very much for the warm introduction, Alistair. And thank you for also mentioning Jean Monnet is someone I take a keen interest in. He's in some senses the quintessential Frenchman, as you can see from the cover of Time magazine, with his sense of dress. But he's also, I think, a transatlantic citizen. He was very comfortable in the corridors of power in Washington. He was a friend of US presidents from FDR to JFK. He attended JFK's funeral as a personal guest of the Kennedy family. But he's also a Londoner, as I read his career, right? He spent seminal moments of his career in London, in the city of London as a young man, learning about banking during the First World War, helping to coordinate wheat supplies. And it was here he saw the ideas that he later applied to the European coal and steel community. He also lived in London during his work for the League of Nations. He was Deputy Secretary General. And one of the things he did for the League was raise loans for Poland, among other countries. And I want to have Jean Monnet in the background of this talk today, because I think his vision of European integration is often misunderstood, right? He's remembered as offering a very general and influential vision of supranational institutions, but he also had a vision of economic governance, which was about borrowing. It was about turning the community and later the union into an organization that could borrow to help its members. And he took those lessons from the League and from his earlier life and applied them in the coal and steel community. They were pioneering ideas that were a bit ahead of their time, but those ideas are now coming to fruition, I want to argue, in the response to two contemporary crises, COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine. So I want to talk about these contemporary crises, but I want to contextualize them by talking about the Euro crisis, right? That's the crisis that we know more about as EU scholars. So I'm going to talk for a few moments about the Euro crisis and try and use it as a baseline to compare what we're seeing in COVID-19 and in relation to the war in Ukraine, because they're three quite different crises. When I talk about economic governance, I'm going to talk about monetary policy, what role the European Central Bank has played. I'm going to talk about fiscal policy, what has happened to the EU's fiscal rules. And I'm going to talk about this vision of Monet and the idea of financial assistance. So I'm going to try and constrain my comments on economic governance to those three key elements. Of course, there are others. So onto the Euro crisis. I often think of this image when I think of the Euro crisis, when a protester disguised herself as a journalist at the ECB in Frankfurt and leapt onto the table during a press conference. The papers went up in the air and she cried out, down with the ECB dictatorship. Right? It seems to capture the sense of passions that surrounded the Euro crisis. To my mind, and maybe I'm not radical enough, she was probably protesting against the wrong organization, right? The ECB under Draghi did an incredible amount to bring that crisis to an end. The crisis began when the global financial crisis pushed the Eurozone into recession. And that was actually the first recession that the Euro had ever experienced, right? It was known for its low growth, but it had grown for the first decade of the Euro, but now it experiences the Great Recession. And that's a very new experience. There's also a really deep recession. GDP contracts by more than 4% in 2009. Of course, that has an immediate knock-on effect for government borrowing. The Eurozone as a whole, but also countries on the geographic periphery, push deep into deficits. They suddenly are borrowing. And this is a problem, of course, for the Stability and Growth Pact. The Pact is a centerpiece of EU economic governance. It prohibits excessive deficits, by which is meant borrowing of greater than 3% of GDP or a stock of debt of greater than 60%. That's in the treaty, but the Pact is a political agreement, and in its original form, a pair of regulations that explains how you enforce those limits on government borrowing. And it also has this aspiration in its original form to have a medium-term balance for government borrowing, so that member states would pursue positions of close to balance or in surplus, and then allow their fiscal stabilizers to work in slowdowns without triggering the 3% deficit. Of course, this doesn't work in the context of the global financial crisis. Member states breach that 3% threshold really quickly. Now, all eyes are in Greece, because Greece experiences not only a slowdown, but also a political scandal, because a new government comes to power headed by George Papandreou and announces that their predecessors have been cooking the books. Basically, there's a misreporting of public finance statistics. I often think of this table from early 2010 as capturing the sense of despair surrounding EU economic governance. So we see the European Commission's forecasts suggesting that government borrowing won't be around 3% of GDP as it was originally claimed it would be. It would be above 12%. Now, what happens at this moment? They turn into the rules. They try and cling to those rules to demonstrate that they have things under control. So Greece offers to reduce its budget deficit to 8.7% in 2010 and 5.6% in 2011. So what's happening here? The Pact is doing something very different than what it was intended for. It's a crisis instrument. And Greece is trying to show that it's got a path back towards compliance and therefore to reassure financial markets. So the Pact and the rules become crisis instruments. This fails spectacularly. Financial markets are not at all convinced. So we see the spread between Greek bonds and German bonds widening by the day in early 2010. Financial markets have lost confidence in Greece. Greece is no longer able to raise new debt on financial markets, so it's in serious trouble. That's true of other countries during this period, of course, Ireland and Portugal, but not to the same degree as Greece. A digression on borrowing at this point. The EU can lend to member states who find themselves in difficulties. That's in Article 143 of the treaty, a provision that most people overlook. Some version of that has been there since the Treaty of Rome. And how does the EU fund this assistance? It borrows on financial markets. The Commission raises a loan on behalf of the EU, and it passes on those funds to member states. And the EU did this quietly with Latvia, Hungary, and Romania when the financial crisis hit. And it did so quite successfully, I think, at least for Latvia and Romania, with a minimum of political contestation. The EU gets together with the IMF and in one case the World Bank for this, and this funding is offered efficiently with a minimum of political contestation. I think thanks in no small measure to Jean Monnet's vision, because Monet was determined from the outset of his leadership of the coal and steel community that the high authority could borrow. So one of his first acts as president was to go to Washington to meet with his old wartime ally, Eisenhower. And Eisenhower came out from this meeting and talked not only about the coal and steel community as a good thing, but also to talk up its ability to borrow. And this helped Monet considerably because Monet was able to raise a loan in America for the coal and steel community from the US Import-Export Bank. And the idea of the community, later EU, as a borrower was born. So we talk a lot about bonds and Eurobonds as a kind of future goal, perhaps, for the European Union, but it's already been happening from the very early days of the coal and steel community. This is, in fact, a Eurobond. issued by the coal and steel community. The catch, of course, is that we can't provide that support to Eurozone countries. That's prohibited in the treaty under Article 143. It's only for member states that have not adopted the euro. That leaves Article 122, which is vague in its wording, right? It talks about financial assistance for countries facing natural disasters or occurrences beyond their control. Does a global financial crisis really count? Does it count if politicians have been hiding the true state of government borrowing, right? So the euro crisis was extended and amplified because of the gaps in the governance architecture. The EU eventually gives money to Greece, as I'm sure you know, in May 2010, and then it creates these new euro crisis mechanisms. The European Financial Stabilization Mechanism, which does rely on Article 122, and these two large funds, the EFSF and the EFSM, together putting nearly €1 trillion on the table to help Eurozone countries. So this is a crisis management in real time, right? They're creating these new instruments. But Monet must have been looking down somewhere, smiling on this, right? The idea of the ESM issuing bonds in the name of the EU, having a AAA credit rating, was central to his vision, right? He thought that the countries could get together and pool not only sovereignty, but credibility, and therefore borrow. Now, before I sound too optimistic about the ESM, it's a pretty brutal instrument, right? If you borrow from it, there's conditions attached. And those conditions attached involve a memorandum of understanding and usually deep cuts to expenditure or tax increases, little emphasis on growth, and questionable debt sustainability analysis, certainly in the case of Greece. It's one reason the IMF was so frustrated at the Eurozone's response. But we do get borrowing, and we get this new instrument created to help with the euro crisis. Now, as someone who studies new intergovernmentalism, a theory of integration, I take great interest in this phase of the crisis. Because I argue in my work with Chris Bickerton and Uwe Puter that the Commission is often not empowered in traditional ways post-Maastricht because it's too controversial. It becomes a target for Eurosceptics. It gets linked to treaty reforms. So it's easier to create new bodies created outside the scope of the EU, perhaps underpinned by international financial institutions. It's easier to ratify a body if it's not grounded in an EU treaty, certainly when it's subject to a lot of contestation. I think of the ESM and the EFSF as archetypes of this de novo body, and it very much chimes with the new intergovernmentalism. These instruments weren't really supposed to be used, at least that was the optimistic scenario. It was supposed to be just a way of showing credibility. Quickly, member states turn to the EU for support through these instruments. Ireland, Portugal, Greece, for a second time, Spain and Cyprus all take loans from these bodies. Now, what about the other aspects of EU economic governance? Well, fiscal policy is not helping much here. There's no stimulus package. There's just reform after reform to the EU's fiscal rules designed to strengthen its credibility. The six-pack, the two-pack, and the fiscal compact are all trying to shore up the credibility of those fiscal rules. That puts the onus on the ECB to do more, which it does through the Security Markets Programme, a program of bond buying, which is quite a big deal for a conservative bank, but very limited compared to what the Fed, for example, was doing during this period. So the ECB is under pressure to do even more, and Trichet finally delivers in July 2012, right? This is a decisive moment in managing the euro crisis when Draghi announces he would do whatever it takes to save the euro. That meant unlimited or at least very large-scale bond purchases. Those bond purchases didn't actually happen until 2015, right? There was a long period of reflection and inertia before we saw these large-scale bond purchases, which reached over 80 million per month from 2015. Nevertheless, it was very significant. It was significant in the words alone, which helped calm financial markets down. So we see these bond spreads falling quite dramatically as soon as Draghi gives a speech in London. You'll see that things change for Greece around about 2014 or 2015. What's happening here is that things are not getting better fast in Greece, right? We've only just seen the stabilization of debt. For all that pain endured in Greece, the debt hasn't even begun to fall by this period, right? It's still very high, it's still unsustainable, yet unemployment is skyrocketing. Over 27% of the civilian labor force are out of work here. So there's enormous pain being imposed on Greece, and Greece is undertaking in the name of getting its public finances under control. So it's not surprising that you get left-wing populists coming to power. Syriza, the radical coalition of the left, wins power, having been a small party before this, and promises to rip up the rules of EU economic governance, to write off Greek debt, to have the ECB print money. So these are seductive promises, but they are completely at odds with what other EU member states want. Not only Germany, but the member states that had endured the pain of their own sovereign debt crises. So of course, as you probably remember, this comes to a head with a referendum in Greece, which rejects the terms of negotiations. It was a very strange referendum where Greek voters were asked to pass judgment on 2 PDF documents, not translated from English, into the arcane details of negotiations. Greek voters reduce it to one word, austerity, and vote against it. Now, what happens after this is really interesting because Tsipras, in some senses, is empowered through this referendum, but he interprets it as a vote against austerity, but for Euro membership. So he pivots towards a more pragmatic stance. He sacks his firebrand finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, and cuts a deal, really controversially, for a third loan package of 85 billion euro. So it's a desperate act. There's even harsher conditions, but they stick to the terms of this bailout package, and Greece exits in 2018. And this aspect of the euro crisis is ostensibly over, right? So it's got a very strange final act in which Greece confronts its EU partners, but then there is a resolution of sorts, albeit a really controversial one, through this ESM loan. So, okay, what's this benchmark of the euro crisis to compare these other crises? Well, monetary policy was slow, but eventually played a key role. So it's a really important actor. Fiscal policy, really unsupportive in retrospect, right? No fiscal stimulus and a real obsession with its own credibility and rules. Financial assistance was key, but it probably prolonged the crisis in a way, right? It was essential and unavoidable, but the strings attached were very painful, those conditions. And the integration dynamics saw this reluctance to delegate. Okay, so on to COVID-19. In the early weeks of the crisis, you might have seen the Rotterdam Philharmonic Orchestra playing Ode to Joy from home. It's an incredibly moving rendition of the European anthem, and it seemed to really cast a critical light on what was actually happening in the EU during this period, which was a crisis of integration. The EU struggled in the early weeks of the pandemic. We see, for example, temporary border restrictions under Schengen. Okay, they're a fact of life in Europe these days, but we also see real strains in the single market, a ban on medical supplies being exported between EU member states, France and Germany, of all member states, blocking cross-border trade in medical supplies. We have the side of Italy turning to China for personal protective equipment. Italy, of course, in the front line of this crisis. Jacques Delors, now in his 90s, made a rare public intervention during this period when he described the EU as being in mortal danger. So there was real concern over the European project during this period. Now, what of the economic aspects of this crisis? I mean, it's first and foremost a crisis of health. Oops. Okay, so, but nevertheless, it's also an economic crisis. I think of Michael O'Leary, CEO of Ryanair, and his very cynical comments in the early weeks of the pandemic, saying it was overblown, that we should move on, that we'd seen past pandemics. Well, quickly, airlines ground to a halt, right? And at the 1st of March 2020, with roughly the same amount of air traffic. By the time the pandemic takes its full force, the airline industry is in a state of crisis. Actually, there are some planes flying in Europe during this period. Many of them are empty. They're just there to ensure pilots keep up their hours and airlines reserve slots. They're known as landing slots, they're known as ghost flights, very controversial environmentally, and a sign of how hard hit the economy was. So, okay, that's just one industry that was hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, that blow is felt across many sectors. Manufacturing, services, and construction simply ground to a halt when the pandemic hits and lockdowns take hold. So it's a sudden, unexpected shock. We see Commission officials now working from home scrambling to revise forecasts. They were expecting 1.4% growth in 2020. That's revised to minus 7.4%. So it's a huge, unexpected economic blow just a few years after the euro crisis came to an end. And the economy is expected to bounce back, but it's still a massive loss in output that's come from nowhere, really. Likewise, employment, having grown a little bit, is now expected to contract. Unemployment, having fallen and come to quite low level by EU standards, is suddenly spiking. It's expected to go to 9%. So there's worry over people's livelihoods. And this is the recipe for another sovereign debt crisis, right? Particularly as Italy's in the front line of what's happening. So there's real worries of where the EU is at in this period. But the ECB moves relatively quickly this time. It's a very different sort of crisis. Christine Lagarde wrong-foots markets by suggesting the ECB doesn't care about bond spreads during this period, but she probably misspoke, and her actions spoke louder than her words, because the ECB very quickly commits 750 billion to bond purchases, which soon becomes nearly 2 trillion. So the ECB is doing here in a matter of weeks what it took years to do in the euro crisis. It's moving incredibly quickly. It's learning basically from the crisis that went on before. What about fiscal policy? Well, here we see the suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact. There's a general escape clause, and finance ministers, having defended the Stability and Growth Pact in the earlier crisis, now said it's time to put it to one side, or at least its financial penalties. I won't read out the accompanying statement, but if you just pick out some of the words from it, flexibility, stimulus, coordination, you can see something really different is going on in this crisis management compared to the euro crisis before it. So we see government borrowing increasing in almost every member state. It does so above 3%. Member states are scrambling to spend on healthcare, on furloughs, on social security, and the Stability and Growth Pact is not going to serve as a constraint on this. It just has to be done. That's the ethos in the EU at this time. And what about financial assistance? Well, the fear that Italy might be in the front line leads to proposals for corona bonds, right? This idea of joint debt being issued. And Giuseppe Conte and Emmanuel Macron were at the center of a call to create this new debt instrument. Merkel said no. And I think not without justification. She said, well, we've already got a debt instrument in the ESM. Couldn't we use this? But the ESM was hugely controversial in Italy because of Eurosceptics like Salvini, who had targeted it in the same way they had targeted the ECB and the Commission for years. They seized upon the ESM in late 2019 as part of their right-wing populist politics, saying the ESM was a threat to democracy. And this meant that Conte couldn't easily go to the ESM without bringing his own government down. So there was a standoff. Italy and other countries needed help, but it wasn't going to come through the ESM. Very quickly, a response came in the form of Next Generation EU, which was this huge new borrowing instrument to borrow 750 billion to help member states recover from the pandemic. It would focus on green, digital, resilient investment. It would involve grants and it would involve loans. So this was an enormous step forward taken in a huge hurry by the European Union. The sight of the EU borrowing was not new. It had dated to the time of Monet, but the sight of the EU borrowing on this scale was extraordinary. In fact, the EU was borrowing on the scale of a state in response to the pandemic. So this is a really big change for EU economic governance. It's certainly a challenge for new intergovernmentalism. How did the Commission come to hold that instrument rather than, say, the ESM or another institution entirely? That's certainly something I'm wrestling with as I think through the new intergovernmentalism. What I would say is that the ESM was new, relatively new, but still carried a lot of baggage, right? As we saw in Italy, it was in the line of fire in the way that the Commission had been regularly post-Maastricht. So in a sense, people like Salvini had poisoned the well for the ESM. So the Commission was actually an easier recipient of delegation in this phase of the pandemic. It was also a temporary instrument, right? The Commission wasn't given a permanent role here. It was given a very short-term instrument subject to a high degree of oversight. Now, however we look at the Recovery and Resilience Plan, what we see here is a very significant act of EU economic governance, right? So we see Italy getting nearly 200 billion in funding from the EU after the pandemic. It's grants and loans. It's covering things like climate objectives and digital transition mainly. The EU, for example, investing heavily in 5G connectivity in Italy. It's going to add between 1.5% and 2.5% to Italian GDP and up to 240,000 jobs. So here's Draghi in this image, now caretaker prime minister, agreeing this deal, the Recovery and Resilience Plan with Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president who did so much to make this instrument happen. It's really, really significant. It casts the EU in a very different role compared to the Euro crisis. What about Hungary and Poland? Colleagues might be interested in what's happening in terms of democracy and the rule of law and next generation EU. So Hungary has asked for funds, but they haven't been agreed yet because of concerns over the rule of law. So there's a degree of political conditionality here being exercised. Hungary didn't ask for that much, so it's questionable how much it really affects Hungary. Poland did ask for a lot, and there was agreement on its plan, but subject to concessions and reforms related to the rule of law. They haven't been forthcoming yet, so neither has the funding. So there's a kind of stalemate with these countries, which are trying to kind of move on without that financial assistance from the EU, but it remains to be seen whether it will be unlocked for Poland and how much it will cost both countries if they don't get that funding. It's easier to do when the economy is rebounding quickly. They have a kind of cushion not to take those funds, but as things take a turn for the worse after the war in Ukraine, the cost on those countries might increase of not playing ball with the EU. So the economy bounces back really quickly after COVID-19. I think it would be wrong to attribute that to next generation EU simply because there's a lag in the funds being spent, right? They're still being attributed. So it's more likely that national fiscal stabilizers and just the sheer fact of taking economies out of lockdown that propelled that recovery. I kind of think that next generation EU may have been so late that it's almost going to be on time. Now, what do I mean by that? There was a risk that they would spend those funds as the economy was racing into a recovery, making it pro-cyclical as an instrument. Actually, the funding may come on stream now that the economy is slowing down again. So it becomes counter-cyclical only by accident in a way. It's slow to move this EU money around. And so the timing is really interesting. It certainly didn't move as rapidly as a national budget would in helping people. Of course, inflation may be the consequence of all of this expenditure and this rapid recovery. We see the first uptake in inflation in the history of the Eurozone. Eurozone was typically associated with very low inflation, actually sometimes deflation, and now it's soaring. And it was increasing rapidly even before the war in Ukraine. So there's a real challenge for the Eurozone economy after COVID-19. And I think in the fullness of time, there'll be questions raised about whether the response was too accommodating economically to what was happening. It may have been morally justified, but there may have been macroeconomic consequences of having such a loose monetary and fiscal policy. So to take stock of COVID-19, the ECB was very quick to react this time, but did it lose sight of inflation? Fiscal policy, much more supportive, and the rules, or at least their most stringent aspects, were put to one side. Financial assistance, really important, but too soon to see its economic effects. And the delegation was interesting. It did empower the Commission, albeit temporarily, and for reasons that were very linked to the ESM's problems of legitimacy. So some, I think, really interesting integration dynamics going on. Okay, so on to the war in Ukraine, which of course is first and foremost a humanitarian crisis, not an economic one. And it's one that's happening to Ukraine first and foremost. Nearly 6,000 civilians killed, 9,000 injured so far, 7.4 million Ukrainian refugees recorded by the UNHCR. So the EU's immediate response was not to think of it in economic terms, but to try and hold Russia to account and to support Ukraine. The EU did this, for example, by triggering the Temporary Protection Directive for the first time. This allowed around 4 million Ukrainians to date to move to the EU, to live and work there for 2 years without going through the usual asylum claim system. And the sight of so many people crossing Europe in the early weeks after Russia invaded was really striking, really visible. Railways allowed Ukrainians to travel for free, and it was a common sight in many European railway stations to see volunteers helping people as they carried what possessions they could across Europe. We also saw the EU cross the Rubicon of common foreign and security policy by providing weapons and other lethal military equipment to a third country for the first time in a wartime situation. So we saw 450 million allocated initially. That's been scaled up to 2.5 billion. It's clearly a lot less than the US is providing. It's less in per capita terms than the UK is providing, but it's very significant for the EU, which still thinks about itself on some levels as a civilian actor. Now, what about financial assistance? Well, the financial assistance is for Ukraine in these early stages of the crisis, right? Not for the EU itself. We see macroeconomic financial assistance, something that's been provided for a long time to third countries, including Ukraine, scaled up. And the EU does borrow for this instrument. So it's now providing 9 billion to the Ukrainian economy, just trying to help its very short-term needs. Macron, who had done so much to get Next Generation EU off the ground, saw an opportunity in the early weeks after Russia invaded and said, what we should do now is borrow to pay for these weapons, right? We should raise funds on financial markets for the European peace facility. It was an unpopular move. There was no appetite for that, especially from Germany, which is, of course, in a state of foreign policy turmoil after its assumptions about Russia were upended. But I would envisage large-scale borrowing for Ukraine by the time this war plays out. So it seems premature to talk about reconstruction in Ukraine, but there are already meetings happening to try and understand how the EU and other international actors can help. We don't know how this war is going to end, but we know it's going to be very costly. And we know that the cost is likely to be borne by an international coalition, of which the US will be a member, but also the European Union. So the EU was part of the Lugano conference in Switzerland this summer, where they had an initial discussion of how much Ukraine might need. Initial estimates include a recent report prepared by Ukraine, the World Bank Group, and the European Commission, which says it's going to be around 349 billion, at least, and that's as of the 1st of June, just to recover. Another estimate by Ukraine at the Lugano conference suggested the figure could be double that. It was quite an ambitious plan to really rebuild a new sort of Ukrainian economy. But it's clear that this is going to involve vast sums that in no scenario will the EU have, and its member states have money to put on the table for. They'll unavoidably have to raise funds on financial markets for this. So expect more borrowing to come. Of course, we see sanctions towards Russia, very stringent sanctions, but we don't see the one sanction that would probably make the decisive difference, which is to end imports of Russian oil or gas, with understandable reasons. The EU, for all its talk of energy security, is heavily dependent on Russia still for imports of oil, accounts for around 29%. Russia accounts for around 43% of natural gas imports. So the context is understandable in which the EU is not willing to go further on these sanctions. But of course, there's consequences. So we see a partial ban on oil that hasn't actually entered into force yet, and it won't involve oil coming through pipelines. There is no ban on gas yet, but there is an agreement to try and reduce demand by 15%. That's a commitment that's bold, but also that's short on detail at the moment. It's unclear how the EU and its member states are really going to deliver on that. Even with those partial policy responses in place, gas and energy prices are soaring in Europe. And of course, this is adding to the problems of inflation facing the Eurozone and the EU at large. So prices were already rising because we were coming out of a lockdown, but now they're soaring because of the increased cost of energy. So this is an unprecedented challenge for the Eurozone, right, which was set up to maintain price stability. And now we have the side of the ECB coming out and saying inflation for the time being will be in the region of 9, even 10%. So this is a huge challenge economically and a very different sort of crisis. We, of course, see that slowdown coming to an end, right? We see growth falling in the Eurozone. The recession is not forecast yet, but I think it's probably only a matter of time. So how is monetary policy responding? Well, it's tightening. We see interest rates increasing in July and September. These are the first interest rate hikes for over a decade, and they're quite significant ones. This may be justified in terms of trying to get inflation under control, but there's real worries of another sovereign debt crisis if member states are struggling under the weight of this monetary tightening. So the ECB creates a new instrument in July called the Transmission Protection Instrument. It will allow unlimited bond purchases for countries that find themselves with difficult financing conditions that don't appear to be justified by fundamentals. So this seems to be the ECB getting out ahead of the curve, learning the lessons, but I think it looks like a problematic instrument. A country can't be in a state of excessive deficit if it's to benefit from this instrument. And that strikes me as a little bit like saying, well, the fire brigade will come to your house, but if they see smoke, they'll turn back, right? I don't imagine any scenario in which you are able to have problems of financing while respecting your excessive deficit. The breach of the pact goes hand in hand with the problems of financing. So clearly, to pass this through the Governing Council, the ECB had to attach a lot of caveats and conditions that, for the time being, to my mind at least, add up to an instrument that doesn't look like it's going to work. So the ECB sees a sovereign debt crisis potentially on the horizon, try and act to head it off, yet has an instrument that looks problematic when you look at the fine detail. It could well be a placeholder for a more flexible instrument to come. Fiscal policy maintains a large measure of flexibility. It's still suspended. It's been suspended for a further year. During this year, member states will discuss a reform of these EU fiscal rules. The Commission is likely to come out later this month with proposals. It's unclear what the direction of travel will be. France and Italy are talking about some sort of golden rule. So they'll take out expenditure on defense and climate change, for example. Germany so far has pushed back against this, but Germany finds itself outnumbered and having its own expenditure commitments on energy that, in a sense, show a flexibility in its own fiscal policy that will make it more difficult for it to play its traditional role as a fiscal hook. So expect a somewhat tense debate over the future of the Stability and Growth Pact. If a sovereign debt crisis hits, we could see a replay of 2010, where the instinct is to tighten these fiscal rules to show credibility. That didn't help much last time around in terms of stimulus package. But for the time being, it's pretty flexible. What about financial assistance for EU member states? Well, Next Generation EU is ongoing. So in a sense, that instrument is there. But right on cue, we see the Commission, in the early days of Next Generation EU saying, well, if this works, maybe we should make it permanent, right? That's how we often expect the Commission to behave. A key voice here is Paolo Gentiloni, the former Italian Prime Minister, who's now European Commissioner for the Economy. He's already making the case for Next Generation EU to be made permanent before Russia invades Ukraine, and he's reiterated these calls during the week. Now, I interpreted these calls as problematic. And I think the fact that they were flowing through the Commission, and particularly through a commissioner, without much support from the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, or any member state so far, suggests that there's a bit of a vacuum here, right? When we saw Next Generation EU created, we see positive noises very early on from Paris and Berlin. And then we see Ursula von der Leyen moving really quickly to help realize those proposals. But the direction of travel was intergovernmental. The fact that the Commissioner is the one leading this debate for the time being should give us pause for thought about whether that instrument would really see the light of day. For the time being, in terms of integration dynamics, I think what we see is that member states are reluctant to delegate. COVID-19 required an exceptional response. It's not paving the way yet for a new instrument. The ESM, indeed, could yet be called into action if countries are pushed into sovereign debt crises. So taking stock of the war in Ukraine, as I begin to finish, monetary policy played an active role in this crisis, but cast itself in a very different part, right? It's tightening monetary policy. It's thinking about maybe sovereign debt crisis, but its instrument lacks credibility so far. Fiscal policy is as supported in this crisis as it was COVID-19. The rules have been set to one side, and they're the subject of debate. Financial assistance, well, I think there's more to come. There's more to come for Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, has been identified as a member state, potentially. Whether or not membership happens, the EU will be bound to take a lead, I think, in helping to rebuild Ukraine, and that will require financial assistance on a scale that will make borrowing inevitable. And if member states face further problems at home, expect some borrowing there too. In terms of integration dynamics, I think we've seen a pronounced reluctance to delegate so far. Member states are not keen to make next generation EU permanent. So let me draw this all together. What have we learned so far from COVID-19 and Ukraine in comparison to what we knew about the euro crisis? Well, perhaps we see a much less conservative ECB, right? It's a much more activist, flexible, fast-moving institution these days than it was in the early stages of the euro crisis. Fiscal policy no longer focused on its own rules to the same degree, right? Much more open to the idea of stimulus and flexibility. That's the watchword. Financial assistance has become central to economic governance, right? There was a time when you could talk about EU economic governance as largely about the ECB and fiscal rules, but it's hard to avoid discussing financial assistance these days. And the integration dynamics are in a state of flux. At times, there's a deep reluctance to delegate to the Commission. We do see temporary delegation to COVID-19, and all EU scholars should be watching very carefully to see what comes next. Will that temporary instrument become a permanent one? Let me give the final word to Monet, or more accurately, Montague Norman, in talking about Monet. Montague Norman was the head of the Bank of England for many years, and he was someone who knew Monet well and who viewed him with a sense of Anglo-Saxon skepticism. And Norman said of Jean Monet, he's not so much a banker as a conjurer. And I think it really captures the spirit of Monet, that he had these formative experiences that he took to the European coal and steel community. He was adamant that it should be allowed to borrow, that member states could benefit from borrowing together. His early attempts were quite successful, but this was still an experiment. And I think it's an experiment that plays out today in a much more meaningful way and a much larger scale. So we often hear talk of the EU's Hamilton moment. Actually, I think it's much more likely a Monet moment, because Monet's vision of the EU as a borrower has really come to pass. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dermot, for that wonderful and comprehensive overview of how EU monetary rules have been evolving. So let me encourage participants to submit questions using the Q&A function. But I'm going to, while you do that, I'm going to abuse my position as chair to sort of to ask a question. You set out really nicely the clear difference in how the EU responded to the COVID crisis compared to the Eurozone crisis. But you didn't tell us why the difference, right? And so is this because it's lessons that were learned from the Eurozone crisis? Is it the argument that COVID is seen as something which has no moral stigma to it? It's not, you don't have the, there's not the profligate, it affects everybody. You don't have the distributional implications that you had quite so clearly in the Eurozone crisis. Is it that we have a different set of politicians who have a different attitude? Why do we see such a dramatic shift from the Eurozone crisis to COVID? And then what does that suggest about what might be happening in response to the cost of living crisis recession we're seeing now?
So it's a great question and a really difficult one, right? I think it's right at the cutting edge of what we need to research as EU scholars, right? What was the fundamental difference or differences that allowed that response? I'm open to the lines of explanation that you pointed towards, right? I think there clearly was a lot of learning, right? There was an understanding that the long delays in offering aid to Greece just made things a lot worse, and the single currency had a lucky escape. I think you had politicians who were really experienced at handling crises, who were ready to move very quickly. Of course, you had Emmanuel Macron, who had, I think, prepared the ground for the creation of Next Generation EU. He had wanted a Eurozone budget. He pushed quite hard for this. He largely failed. He just got a symbolic instrument created, but that was a kind of blueprint for what followed. But I think there was other elements to this explanation. I think one element of it was the fact that right-wing populists were caught cold by COVID-19. They really struggled in those early months of COVID-19 to mobilize. You know, it was too early to play the role of vaccine skeptic or lockdown skeptic. Such was the very real and material threat from from the pandemic. So they kind of were sidelined. And if you look at Germany, the AfD, which had been a source of huge pressure for Merkel as she took decisions on the euro crisis, for a small window were marginalized. And I think Merkel looked at that situation, saw that she had room for maneuver domestically, and empowered the Commission. Had she waited, I think, till later in the crisis, where we do see the right-wing populists coming back in Germany and in other countries, I think we would have seen something much more like the ESM as the solution to that crisis. So there may have just been a temporary window in those early months of the pandemic, which allowed creative choices, and the sense of uncertainty about what was to come allowed for very bold leadership of the kind that was really absent, I think, in the euro crisis, where decisions were taken piecemeal with Eurosceptics breathing down politicians' necks. Now, what does that mean for Ukraine? Because you talked about that. Well, it's a really different type of crisis, right? I think we see the right-wing populists in a bit of a tailspin in the early weeks of the war, but they've regrouped, and I think they could just as easily mobilize the politics of austerity and moral hazard to argue against something like an extension of next generation EU, which is probably why we haven't seen a push for a centralized budget instrument so far.
Thank you. I have one question coming, but I'd like to ask a follow-up. It's related, but it's narrower, and which is because there was the big question was about dramatically different responses to the crises, but this also seems to be a different attitude toward. I mean, shall we say, the monetarist ideas are not as were enshrined in the Maastricht Treaty. That was a particular moment where you had a lot of central, monetarism was really strong. You had a lot of center-right governments, and now there is a view that and I mean, and it's broader than just the EU, and it's broader than than just fiscal policy, but that governments should be more activist in managing the economies than in the past. You see this industrial policy, calls for industrial policy as well as more fiscal policy. So do you see this as a sort of a reaction to the lessons learned about what happened to Greece? Is it, because you see that some of that thinking with the IMF, realizing that, actually blanking on the increment about how much spending contracts for how much GDP contracts for every cut in government spending is much bigger than they thought. So is it that lesson learning? Is it that we have a new set of economic ideas? We have these, we had Keynesianism, we had monetarism, now we're going back to Keynesianism. This is a wider shift in the sort of the economic orthodoxy.
So not so narrow a question, right? Because it's engaging with the history of economic ideas. I read Maastricht as kind of new Keynesian rather than monetarist. What do I mean by that? It was this idea that if you had an independent central bank that focused on price stability, and you had a set of fiscal rules that constrained your worst instincts as a government with one eye on the electoral cycle, then it would bring an end to boom and bust. That was Gordon Brown's famous line on it. And I think that paradigm came up short because of the nature of the euro crisis, where we suddenly saw economic situations and turmoil that we previously associated with emerging markets, right? Where we saw massive deficits, where we saw huge problems in raising funds to service the public debt or extend the public debt. And so I think the EU found itself in a way beyond the paradigm, because the paradigm didn't really have an easy solution to this, because new Keynesianism didn't have such a well-developed view of what to do in these crises. So there was a huge amount of experimentation and innovation going on to try and work their way through this crisis. Then you do see a kind of Keynesian turn. Certainly with the Stability and Growth Pact, you have a more pragmatic approach from the Commission, a push from some left-wing governments in Europe to try and not be so draconian in tightening those fiscal rules, which I think partly explains that flexibility. But I think it's too soon to say whether we have an entirely different paradigm or whether we've had a kind of holiday from economic ideas for a brief period. And if I think back to the kind of early months of COVID-19, I was really struck by the kind of strong assumptions about how it was now okay to issue new debt because interest rates would be so low for so long, and that there was a kind of room to do this on a massive scale. And I think if you take that thinking too far, you run into the kind of problems that the UK found in the last weeks, which is the idea that there may be a small window to do this in a pandemic when interest rates were quite low, but the ground can suddenly shift under you. And what we found in the UK this week is that they don't really have an economic paradigm. They have populist messages that come a cropper when confronted with financial markets. So far, we haven't seen that in the EU, where I think they've kind of internalized a bit of discipline along the way. So the French budget was more modest, postponed tax cuts, certainly on things like inheritance tax. So I guess the answer to your question is that for a brief time, we might have taken a holiday from these economic paradigms of sorts. But I think those paradigms are now back in play, particularly in times of inflation and when the financial markets are suddenly so jittery over the fiscal announcements of member states. It's unclear what that kind of adds up to. Peter Hall, for me, is a key scholar here. He talks about the breakdown of paradigms being messy. You often see ad hoc measures justified in the name of crisis responses that just don't cohere. And the new paradigm comes much more slowly, right? It's not about learning, but it can be quite abrupt. I guess that's how I would think about the role of economic ideas in this phase of the crisis.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Michael Bond, who says, if Germany and the other frugals were to agree to new EU borrowing to fund additional spending for whatever purposes, what would they insist on in return?
So that's an interesting question about the future, which is very difficult to answer. I guess my initial reaction is that who are the frugals these days, right? And one of the really interesting things about the pandemic was how you had the new Hanseatic League, which was this group of more or less Northern European countries, although Ireland found itself, as the kind of almost like treated like a Baltic country, being this strong coalition in support of austerity. And that kind of melted away very, very quickly when COVID-19 hit. And we're seeing a kind of reconstitution of a frugal coalition. But so far, I only really see the Netherlands and Germany as very vocal actors here in this, warning against updating Next Generation EU. What might they ask for? Well, they may block the extension of Next Generation EU entirely. They may take the line that Merkel tried to take in the early days of the pandemic, which was to say, this is what the ESM is for. If countries are pushed into a crisis, that's what they need to do. It needs to be lending subject to strong conditionality. And they could really dig in on that. I suspect that might be the direction of travel if they find themselves in a strong position. They might insist on the rules being much tighter on fiscal policy, as we saw in 2010, even though that was kind of unhelpful for the recovery from the Eurozone crisis. My feeling, however, is that the question of borrowing for Ukraine is quite different. I think here we'll see Germany and other member states with a fairly strong consensus on the need to take the lead along with the US in helping Ukraine recover. I think that will be seen through a geopolitical lens. And I think there's strong support for doing this, perhaps off budget, perhaps through an institution like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. But I think there won't be kind of penny pinching when it comes to providing funds to Ukraine.
All right, we have another question from Olivia Arends. What is driving EU providing funds for weapons to Ukraine? Did this come from Eastern Europe or as a mark of a more general support for Ukraine?
What's a really good question from Olivia. I think I was struck by the power of public opinion in the early weeks of the war here. Of course, this was the second time that Russia invaded Ukraine. There had been tensions in Ukraine for well over a decade that went largely unnoticed in the public arena. An exception was perhaps the Dutch referendum on the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which of course rejected that agreement before it eventually entered into force at the insistence of the government. So public opinion has been kind of absent on Ukraine by and large. And I think there was a window in those early weeks of the war in which the EU might have adopted a more pragmatic tone, perhaps to wait and see whether this might be a short war, to understand what was happening in many ways, much like they did in 2014, when they tried to broker peace, and a very unstable peace it proved to be. But I think such was the strength of public opinion and the sense of sympathy and identification with the people of Ukraine, that policymakers found themselves under enormous pressure to act really quickly. And I showed an image of the Berlaymont lit up in yellow and blue. Well, in London, and I'm certainly sure it's the same in other European capitals, we saw this visual sign of solidarity and support with Ukraine for weeks after that invasion began. And there was a public demand for that kind of policy response. And I think policymakers in Brussels were under intense pressure to act. And I think that was one of the reasons why they lent their support to this sudden change in foreign policy. And you even see neutral countries not blocking it, right? I'm from Ireland, and the speed with which Ireland countenanced such policies while not contributing towards certain elements of that package was remarkable. It showed things had really changed. And so I think it was public opinion has been the key causal factor, which has been overlooked maybe in explanation so far on why you get that sudden change.
Thank you. Well, waiting for more questions to come in, I want to ask you a question that sort of puzzled me, right? Because when we have with the creation of the Next Gen funds, there was the building into it of the funds could be withheld for rule of law concerns, but the funds needed to be agreed unanimously. And so there's this little, and I know there was a subsequent court, there was there was this funny agreement where there could be a legal challenge to whether that could be done or not. Do you have sort of any insight to what the political dynamics were that led to Poland and Hungary accepting that condition in Next Gen EU, where they could have been very awkward on that very important issue, where they have been on some other issues?
So I think my reading of that would begin one step earlier in how this political conditionality came to be discussed. And if you look at the Netherlands and its response to the early weeks of the pandemic, it initially did play this role as the kind of austere member state that was going to bring Europe to its senses and push member states towards the ESM. And the arguments from the Dutch finance minister at the time went down really badly. And the Portuguese prime minister pushed back against those comments and said they were repugnant and against the spirit of European solidarity, which was so strong in some respects in those early weeks. And so the Dutch, as I read it, tried to block talk of next generation EU and failed. Their arguments just didn't play out and were not politically appropriate in that environment. So they switched tack. And what they did in the June summit was switch focus to the rule of law. And we've seen this a little bit from the Dutch government over the years, for example, blocking Schengen membership from Bulgaria and Romania, where this policy towards Central and Eastern Europe is a kind of salve for Eurosceptics in the Netherlands. I'm putting it too starkly, but I think there was a sense in which the Dutch government switched focus, start talking about the rule of law, and insisted on that political conditionality. In Poland and Hungary, at that stage, didn't know what kind of funding they would need. It was so fluid as a pandemic that it made sense for them to at least allow for the possibility of funding in the hope that they might be able to fudge some of the bargaining over the rule of law. And I think that was just what they needed to do to keep those funds open and available. And they chose to do that. I think they might have also calculated that they probably didn't need that money at a different stage. So the delay in which those countries sought the funding may have been their calculation of, well, we can just do it alone. If we're rebounding so quickly from the lockdown, perhaps we don't need it and we'll kind of call the EU's bluff. That's where I think the war in Ukraine is a game changer, where suddenly Central and Eastern Europe finds itself more vulnerable, and the pressure on those countries to get those funds goes up. And at this point, we see Poland, in a way, willing to talk and negotiate with the Commission on the possibility of reforms to do with judiciary in return for unlocking those funds. And yet, they don't take the step needed to unlock the funds. So there's that kind of stalemate. So I think it's a combination of the Netherlands pushing the deal in that direction, Hungary and Poland playing along, and so far it being a kind of a little bit of a diplomatic dance where the costs are not that great yet for Hungary and Poland. If the economic conditions continue to deteriorate, that's when the political conditionality might bite.
Thank you. Oh, we've got another question from Michael Bond. How does the EU square the circle of dealing with rising public debt levels in the member states and the need for some kind of economic governance rules, or are the latter destined to be simply indicative or symbolic?
Well, I mean, it's precisely the puzzle that it's wrestling with in the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. I think it's understood that the EU needs fiscal discipline as part of the constitution of economic and monetary union. There's an understanding that if there's a reckless approach to fiscal policy, then the cost is very high, not only for the countries concerned, but for the Eurozone as a whole. And I would think that that's behind the comparative restraint shown by some governments, in most governments in the EU, compared to, say, the UK in their management of the issue of energy subsidies. So there's a kind of, in a sense, the doctrinal rules that we saw in the Stability and Growth Pact have kind of been replaced by internal rules, where it's understood that you have to show a degree of restraint. Now that's, I think, easier to do in an era of low interest rates and recovery. I think it gets really difficult when monetary policy pulls in one direction, when the financial markets are much jumpier than they were, let's say, in the early months of COVID-19. I think at that point, the internal rules might not be enough. It's at that point then you get a replay of where Greece was at in early 2010, desperately trying to show compliance, that the rules suddenly need to be visible and tangible and no longer internal. So that's one reaction. I think the other is that the Commission has learned the hard way that it cannot enforce those rules very effectively by itself without political ownership. And I think Jacques Delors saw this actually already in the Maastricht negotiations. So Delors was not a fan of those rules. He saw them as setting the Commission up to fail. And what the Commission learned from the first decade of economic and monetary union was that if it found itself to be the guardian of those fiscal rules against recalcitrant member states, it would really struggle. This is where it found itself in 2003 with France and Germany, where the Commission really pushed hard for member states to comply, but it just wasn't going to happen. You can't take on a sovereign country and play kind of bad cop on something like fiscal policy. France and Germany just won that particular political battle. And I think the Commission learned a lot from that and tried to not put itself out up front as the kind of enforcer of those fiscal rules. And I think that tendency has remained in the current Commission, where there's a belief in fiscal rules, but it's a kind of invitation to member states to take the lead in enforcing them. And so there was some discussion in the media today about what the reform of the Pact might look like. And the Commission is saying, well, it needs to be flexible, right? Member states need to provide those commitments. We can't be the actor who's got the financial penalties that threatening member states with. It won't work. And so they've learned, I think, the hard way that the Commission's powers are limited. Romano Prodi famously called the Stability and Growth Pact stupid. This was, I think, a misstep at the time. And I think he was calling into question the numbers that were used to calculate what was sustainable debt and what wasn't. But I think on a more fundamental level, Prodi understood the limits of Commission power against sovereign member states, and that the Commission could not tell member states what to do when it comes to fiscal policy. And so I think that doesn't necessarily square the circle of what we see, but it tries to understand why the Commission is not upfront asking for a very draconian set of fiscal rules that would be left to it to enforce.
Thank you. We've got a question from Janiko. This is going to push you a little bit, but outside the topic. We'll let you have a stab at it, and I have perhaps a twist that is a little closer to the talk. So the question is, what in your opinion is the future of Italy as a member of the EU in terms of human rights and the Ukraine-Russia war? I don't know, perhaps a closer question is, do you have a sense, I mean, I know like the new government is being formed, but do you have a sense of how the new Italian government might view, issues associated with economic and monetary union, and how Eurosceptic, I mean, there are Eurosceptic parts and less Eurosceptic parts.
So I've written about this for my forthcoming book on the history of the EU, which will be called Circle of Stars, and hopefully will be out next year with Yale Press. And what I was really struck by in writing that part of the book was the stance taken against Austria in 2000, when Jörg Haider's Freedom Party had a stunning election victory in Austria. And the approach of member states at the time was to take a really principled, tough stance against Austria and to cry foul against this right-wing populist party that spoke in such problematic terms about minorities, about migrants, that seemed to violate the EU's fundamental rights at the same time as they were being written, right? This was a period in which the Charter on Fundamental Rights was being written. And I think the tough line taken by member states encountered some of the same problems as the Stability and Growth Pact, right? Taking a stand against a sovereign government on an issue of national sensitivity can rebound very easily on Brussels. And so having isolated Austria, other member states found themselves isolated very quickly, and they backed down. And although talk of EU fundamental rights continued in things like the European Constitution and later Lisbon, it was a chastening experience, I think, for the defense of EU values. Member states passed the baton over to the European Commission to try and enforce those fundamental values, which it really struggled to do in relation to Poland and Hungary. And with the new Italian government on the horizon, I've been struck at the same time by how normalized right-wing populists have become in Europe. And the sense in which there's nothing to see here is the message coming from publications like The Economist. They're the noises coming out of Brussels. I think partly carry those 3 decades of experience, right? This idea that Brussels will struggle to take a stand, but also what seemed exceptional in 2000 when Haider came to power is now regrettably normal and has been normalized. So to answer the question more directly, I think the new Italian government won't seek confrontation over the euro, not at this moment. I think they learned the lesson of their predecessors, the populist coalition, which hinted at some sort of synthetic currency that might allow the lira to be reintroduced, that led to a lot of instability on financial markets. And it also led to a big backlash from Italian business. And so I think there's not much mileage to be had out of being anti-euro and seeking to leave the euro. I think right-wing populists have dialed back on that in Europe. We see it also in France with Le Pen, where she had argued for a referendum on the euro, now argues that she supports the euro. So they understand the kind of limits of doing that. And I think that it's those kind of policies that are used as a kind of vehicle to say, okay, these are different sorts of right-wing populists. Let's not get carried away in thinking about what they might be. But if you look at what those politicians say about minorities or migrants, it's as bad as it was in 2000 and arguably worse. So I would expect the Italian government to take a really tough line on Schengen, on the question of irregular flows of migrants into Italy, like we've seen with Salvini, but I think even more so. And this puts the EU in a moral bind, right? It seems relieved at the idea that we have a government that won't be picking a fight on European integration in general or Euro membership in particular, but the cost of that is the continuing weakness and contradiction of the EU's fundamental values. So I'm pretty disappointed at the reaction to the new Italian government to say that there's nothing to see here. Actually, that's only true in the sense that these kinds of politicians have been normalized over 3 decades. And I think it casts the EU in a really bad light.
Thank you, I guess. Thank you for the answer. Suppose I'd like to pick up there are a couple of issues that you raised earlier, and I like to ask how they link together. So for one thing, you sort of said the next gen EU funding might be so late that it's coming at the right time. But that's also coming at a time, so there is a slowdown, there is a cost of living crisis, but we are also dealing with rapid inflation. So this EU splurge is now coming at a time when there are already inflationary pressures. So how do you see that playing out?
So I guess it's framed as a kind of supply side instrument, right? That it's investing in 5G, it's investing in infrastructure. And if that works, the logic of that is that should reduce inflationary pressures, right? It should increase potential output in places like Italy, which have encountered the limits of growth kind of structurally for over 30 years. And so I think there isn't a contradiction between spending and being tough on inflation, and to have monetary policy so tight, and I'd expect interest rates to go up and up. I think it's no bad thing to see the EU trying to invest in the supply side, right? If it was exclusively a kind of demand side instrument that was really helping to overheat the economy, I think that would be a different story. I think it's much more likely to instead to be really tight monetary policy and high inflation that pushes the EU into a recession. And so it's a good thing to see the EU doing what it can to something like Next Generation EU. I think it's certainly better than where we were in 2010, where we're talking about rules, credibility. Meanwhile, Greece is not growing, and it's the real burden of its debt is escalating. And I think if the EU can pull it off, then that's a kind of nice policy mix. I think the fear is that Next Generation EU runs out before it really starts to have that effect, right? That it's probably 2 years left on that, the window to spend that money. And so there's a risk that the political coalition is not there, that we revert to something like the ESM. If the ESM were smart, it would learn the same kind of lessons like the IMF did, which you alluded to earlier, which it needs to be much more about growth, not just about austerity. But it's unclear whether the ESM will have learned those lessons. So yeah, I think I'd point towards that policy mix of loose fiscal and tight money not being the worst thing for the EU economy right now.
All right. Well, I have one question, slightly more parochial, but for you, because you mentioned that Ireland's now become sort of an official, honorary Nordic country, and of course Ireland was one of the countries that benefited immensely from EU membership, and for a long time was a net recipient of funds from the EU budget. And I believe Ireland has now just ticked over into being a slight net contributor. So what is sort of Ireland's view on the whether tighter or looser, the budget and fiscal rules is how is that sort of, has that changed with its own progress? Or
well, I mean, it was so interesting to see the conceptualization and reconceptualization of Ireland, right? So when it's struggling as part of the geographic periphery, you have derogatory terms like pigs being used to describe Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. But then when it exits its program, begins to grow again, it's suddenly, courted as a kind of Northern European member state. And it kind of plays along with that before COVID-19. And a lot of people were really questioning that as whether it's sensible policy, whether it's really credible, that Ireland should have known better about how quickly a well-performing economy can find itself in serious trouble. And the speed with which Ireland left that Hanseatic League 2.0, I think, was about listening to critics of that approach to foreign policy, right? Ireland was very early on in calling for Corona bonds in supporting Italy and France in those calls. So we've seen Ireland I think, drop the pretense of being a new Netherlands and understanding perhaps where its allies are within the EU or what member states are like-minded. And I think a key factor has also been Brexit, where Ireland found itself extraordinarily vulnerable to Brexit. The economic costs of Brexit were perhaps greater for Ireland potentially than they were for the UK. And they were pretty dramatic, of course, for the UK. So Ireland mobilized really quickly to make these arguments in Brussels and got a hearing. And so the fact that the EU took the Good Friday Agreement so seriously at a time when the government in London seemed to completely disregard it, I think was a really important moment for Ireland in its relationship with Europe, where it understood that perhaps traditional alliances with the UK were under strain, and that the EU, so often seen as a club of large states, stood with Ireland during this period, as, by the way, did the United States. Support of the United States for Ireland in these negotiations and the defense of the Good Friday Agreement was absolutely critical. So I think Ireland has found itself, in a sense, enjoying the benefits of being an EU member state while watching its closest neighbour endure the pain economically and politically of leaving the EU. So I think for the time being, Ireland is a kind of poster child for the kind of progressive pro-European state that understands the benefits of EU membership and takes an enlightened view. Now that can change really, really quickly, and I wouldn't take it for granted. So in my book, I've gone back over the combustible politics of the Nice and Lisbon referendums in Ireland, where very quickly a country where there's strong consensus on the benefits of European integration can suddenly be seduced by right-wing populist arguments about the defense of national sovereignty, about Ireland's policies on abortion, for example, about Ireland's neutrality. And very quickly, political outsiders can mobilize and get a lot of leverage, even in a country like Ireland. Perhaps especially, right, because you've got such consensus from the main political parties that it allows those politicians to be outflanked by Eurosceptics. And so I take nothing for granted in Ireland that it's amazing to watch its journey through Brexit and to see its concerns become the EU's concerns in something like the Northern Ireland Protocol. That wasn't taken for granted, and it tells you something about the benefits of EU membership. What I would add into this is that the disruptive potential of the next government in Ireland is considerable. So Sinn Féin have a very strong prospect of leading the next government in Ireland. And that is an interesting moment, right, for Ireland's EU membership or for the EU in general. Sinn Féin is a different party in some respects these days with regard to its policies on Europe. It had been against Nice, had been against Lisbon. Now it sees itself in the light of Brexit as a more pro-European party, but it's also pretty opportunistic. And it also might seek to exert the kind of leverage that Ireland got over Brexit towards something like a United Ireland as a negotiating issue. Anything can happen at that point. I'm minded of the reaction of EU partners when Syriza gained power in Greece with left-wing populist promises. That was a very disruptive period for the EU. So Ireland, which seems such a kind of anchor of pro-European sensibilities right now, could quickly be a very different type of member state that causes a lot of headaches in the EU if Sinn Féin win power.
Right. Well, we don't have any more questions and we're almost out of time. So I'd like to say thank you very much for an extremely clear and extremely interesting presentation. And I, for one, will be looking out for your new book, which sounds fascinating. You've done an excellent job of trailing it. So thank you very much. We will have, I can applaud for everybody. But thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to the participants for your questions.
Thanks very much indeed for the invitation.